When can the president use the National Guard? Federal troops in American cities. Governors suing the president to limit his power. What does the law say? And what does history tell us? This is when the president can take control of the National Guard. Congress created the modern National Guard in 1903, converting state militias to follow regular Army standards, funding them and organizing them under one banner. Most of the time, National Guard units belong to the states. They report to state governors and provide support for emergencies like hurricanes, wildfires, and riots. But the Guard is also part of the U.S. military reserves. Title 10 of the U.S. Code allows the president to federalize the National Guard, making state Guard units report to the commander-in-chief instead of the governor. During World War II, President Roosevelt federalized 300,000 National Guard troops to deploy to Europe and the Pacific. This was clearly constitutional, overseas deployment for a major war that was declared by Congress. Presidents can federalize the Guard for national emergencies like war. All recent U.S. presidents, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, have had federalized National Guard troops serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. Other times, a state governor will ask the president to federalize their Guard troops to help with a state emergency. So a governor with a big crisis on their hands will ask the president to take control and use federal money and military coordination to solve the problem. In 1992, Los Angeles experienced large-scale looting and rioting. Governor Pete Wilson of California asked President George H.W. Bush to help. The federal government took over emergency response. President Bush federalized the California Guard and deployed 3,500 infantry soldiers and Marines to Los Angeles along with National Guard units. He invoked the Insurrection Act to do this, which gives the president power to use the military for emergencies within the United States when requested by a governor. There's an important limitation to the president's power to use the military inside the United States. This law is called the Posse Comitatus Act. It prohibits the military from acting as police in America. Federal troops cannot arrest, search, or detain civilians, even when federalized. The Insurrection Act is an exception to Posse Comitatus. If and only if the president invokes the Insurrection Act, then the military, and by extension the National Guard, can act as law enforcement in the U.S. The Insurrection Act also gives the president the power to take control of the National Guard without being asked by a governor, and even against the governor's wishes. In 1954, the Supreme Court outlawed segregating public schools by race. 3 years later, Central High School in Arkansas was still denying admission to black students. Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas wanted to keep it that way, even though federal law had changed. The Arkansas governor deployed his state's National Guard units to stop black students from entering the school. Governor Faubus was defying a federal court order. President Dwight Eisenhower responded by using the Insurrection Act. He took control of the Arkansas National Guard. He sent the 101st Airborne Division of the Army to enforce the federal court order over the governor's wishes. The now federalized Guard troops and the Army Division protected the first black students as they were allowed to enroll and enter the public school. The president can invoke the Insurrection Act if there's a rebellion against the government or if state or federal law is being obstructed. In the 1960s, Presidents Kennedy and Johnson both used federal troops to force southern states to accept racial integration and to suppress violence. They invoked the Insurrection Act to enforce new federal laws on the states. In 2025, President Trump federalized some of California's National Guard units in response to protests in Los Angeles. He deployed approximately 2,000 troops to the city. Governor Gavin Newsom sued the president, saying California didn't ask for help and that the protests were not an emergency. California's lawyers argued the president was overstepping his authority and using the military for political purposes. The president's lawyers argued the president has sole discretion to declare the emergency and that courts cannot second-guess that judgment. The court agreed with the president about the emergency, ruling he was acting in good faith and within a range of honest judgment in responding to violence in Los Angeles happening the day before his order. But the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals held that the president's decision can be reviewed by the courts and that he must be acting honestly and within the facts. Later in 2025, President Trump federalized more Guard units from multiple states and sent them to Portland in response to protests. He deployed around 1,500 troops. The city of Portland and the state of Oregon sued the president and got a temporary restraining order stopping the troops from deploying, saying that they did not ask for help and that there was no emergency. Portland's lawyers argued there was no violent threat that justified the president's action. The federal government said Portland was failing to protect federal property and that the Guard was needed to ensure enforcement of federal laws. As of October 2025, President Trump has not formally invoked the Insurrection Act. Instead, the Trump administration cites a different section of the code which allows federal troops to deploy for emergencies. But the president and his lawyers do use terms like rebellion to justify his use of the Guard. If the Insurrection Act is not invoked formally, as we discussed, the Posse Comitatus Act remains in effect and the Guard and broader military cannot act as police. What about ICE agents? How are ICE arrests and deportations different from using the National Guard? ICE is a civilian law enforcement agency created by Congress in 2003. The Posse Comitatus Act only restricts the military, not federal law enforcement agencies. The FBI enforces federal criminal law, the IRS enforces tax law, and ICE enforces immigration law. They are all part of the executive branch and they report to the president. But state representatives in Congress decide federal agencies' missions, the size of their budgets, and can dictate their conduct. In 2025, President Trump federalized National Guard units from Illinois and Texas and directed them to the Chicago area in response to protests at an ICE facility. He deployed approximately 500 troops total. Governor J.B. Pritzker and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson sued the president, saying Illinois did not ask for help and that the protests were not an emergency. Illinois' lawyers argued there was no violent threat that justified the president's action and that the sporadic protests did not constitute a rebellion. The federal government said the protests had involved violence and property damage and that the Guard was needed to protect federal officers and ensure enforcement of immigration laws. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with Illinois and blocked the deployment of troops to Chicago. In its final ruling, the court wrote that political opposition is not rebellion and that the facts did not justify the president's actions. The court noted that the Trump administration's own public statements about successful deportation operations in Chicago contradicted its claim that it was unable to execute federal law without military assistance. When federal appeals courts disagree with each other on the same legal question, called a circuit split, the Supreme Court often steps in to settle it. With multiple states challenging these deployments in different courts, the Supreme Court may soon clarify or update the law on these issues. The president has significant power to federalize the National Guard. Most of the time, it's practical and uncontroversial, like deploying troops overseas or helping states during disasters. But when the president federalizes troops over a governor's objection or uses them for domestic law enforcement, it becomes a constitutional battle over presidential power versus states' rights. What do you think about the laws that govern the National Guard?